first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to this series. It's, I think, one of the great things for me to see is the vibrant and growing queer community in classics, and it's fabulous, and long may it continue. Now, I always like to get my apologies in first, and I have quite a lot of them for this paper. First, first of all, I want to apologize for not being here on previous occasions, which is bad. And I think last week I got sidetracked by what was going on politically at the time, so sorry about that. And I'm also secondly conscious that this paper is not really on topic, although the organisers have very kindly allowed it. So I'm not going to be exploring a foundational myth of queerness or transness, although I could talk about Athena or Tiresias, or dive into the Metamorphoses, or look at Attis, or any of those, but I'm not going to do that. One of the side effects for me of being involved in the recent Queer Euripides project was, apart from finding out how out of touch I am, was that I really seem to have lost the joy of theory, which I once had. And although that might have been pleasing to my supervisors if I'd come across this loss of joy earlier, it's something that I slightly regret. I also regret that this paper is not going to be about the joy of being trans either. And it's going to be a very negative paper. Okay, another apology is that in order to draw out the connections I'm going to make, I'm going to have to spend quite a bit of time going over the anti-trans backlash. Here I'm going to be using the typically underhanded techniques of the trans rights activist and be actually talking about evidence. Now, if you're familiar with all this stuff, you may want to go and make a cup of coffee while I'm going through it. If you're here just for the Euripides, you can stay tuned and we will get there in the end. Now, it may well be that particularly this audience that you are familiar with all this stuff, but I have had it brought home to me on at least a couple of occasions in the not so distant past that really there are a lot of people who aren't familiar with this backlash, which is one of the reasons why I'm going to be spending some time on it. So for example, I was having a conversation with my line manager at work saying how I was no longer comfortable at work with colleagues in the school and indeed my unit campaigning against trans rights and about EDI more generally. And my line manager was completely unaware that this was even a thing. Also, on a more amusing note, I was at a queer pub quiz with my partner, and we named our team in an ironic tribute to Kathleen Stock, and this went completely over the head of the host, who had not seemed to have heard of this particular person. Now, it may just have been a very unfunny joke on my part, but still, this has brought it home to me that not everyone is as familiar or as deep into this kind of material as I am. And if you're not someone who reads the Telegraph or the Times or the Mail or the Guardian, or is spending your time in that part of Twitter, you may not necessarily be familiar with everything that is going on. For anyone here who's a Euripides specialist, everything that I say about Euripides Medea is going to sound awfully familiar if you've ever read any work on it from a faintly feminist perspective. But I think this is important, and the connections need to be drawn out. So I make no particular claims to novelty here. And finally, just in case anyone from the Daily Mail has walked in, I'm going to offer a content warning. This is the Medea. We will be talking about violence, and we will be talking about violence against women and children. These are subjects that need to be taken with the utmost seriousness and respect. And one of my contentions is that in the discussion of or backlash against trans rights, neither of those things are the case, that they are not treated either with seriousness or respect. So enough of the preamble. So I'm going to start by talking about the title of the paper, which may well be self-evident. Why is Medea shocking? Well, it culminates in the death of 2 children at the hands of their mother. But the bare question, why is it shocking? And a simple answer hide a number of assumptions and preconceptions. One of these is the question of to whom it's shocking. Now, at this point, I think I am going to probably move away from the script and just talk around the slides, if I may. So, one of the reasons I first started talking about Medea or thinking about Medea is that it used to be my party piece, particularly in things like Open Days, to try and show how it might be that different cultures would make very different things of a play such as Medea over the question of infanticide, given that it seems probably that infanticide was far more widely practiced in ancient Greece than it is today, at least in the north of the world. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen, obviously, but if we were to take seriously, and then there is a question about this, whether we should take it seriously, the information in tragedy and new comedy, for example, it seems to be more of a given than perhaps we would allow in our culture. However, I think the truth on reflection is far more complicated than that, and that there are a lot more continuities between the ancient world and the modern world. And part of that is also because obviously the modern world is a very variable place indeed. And I'm going to talk a bit about the data on filicide, infanticide, and neonaticide later on in the paper. Let me move first to the anti-trans backlash. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. The position of trans people has, over the past 70 years, been one of increasing rights and visibility. And this has culminated in the UK with the Gender Recognition Act 2004 and the Equality Act 2010. What had been if not straightforward, at least a relatively progressive movement has come to something of a juddering halt from the mid-2010s onwards. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this has come out of a number of different traditions. One of them is the US Christian evangelical right, with their concerns for LGBT plus people generally, and a particular concern with abortion, as we know. There was a decision made at an evangelical conference, this is reported by the Southern Poverty Law Center, to focus on trans issues as a wedge because it seemed that gay and lesbian visibility and rights were so well entrenched. Now, that may be a slight oversimplification. The second strand is coming out of East European populism and authoritarianism. And this is where the term gender ideology comes from, which is often used in anti-trans discourse. Now, the focus of this tradition is much more on feminism and on LGB rather than LGBT rights. Graf and Kornilchuk have pointed out that in East European traditions, particularly in Poland, trans is very much a minor theme, and it's much more on feminism, reproductive rights and abortion, and homosexuality. And then in the UK, which broadly draws on the US tradition in many respects, and players in the US tradition have sent people and money into the UK context. In addition, though, in the UK is characterized by a strand of essentialist feminism, which obviously goes back to 1970s kind of stuff. So there's a mix of traditions, and it's sometimes difficult to get a handle on anti-trans rhetoric, because partly because they never commit to what they're actually going to do or their policy proposals, but also because they've got these different traditions. And it also means you get some very strange bedfellows, such as self-professed feminists lining up with anti-abortionists, for example. Now, none of this is controversial, and it has been laid out in reports by the Rapporteur on Human Rights for the United Nations and for the Council of Europe. I'm going to distinguish between the ideological goals of this movement and its political rhetoric. Now, its ideological goals are essentially eliminationist. They wish to drive trans people out of the public sphere to prevent or minimize or decrease people transitioning. And this is made clear in things like the so-called Women's Declaration. Now, this isn't actually the usual political rhetoric, but a lot of the political rhetoric focuses on so-called reasonable concerns, which are all about safeguarding and protection of women and children. And this is the connection to Medea. Can I have the next slide, please? Concrete outcomes of this, or actions that have been taken in this tradition. One big strand of activity has been a series of law court cases, crowdfunded usually, trying to undermine the Equality Act 2010 and other aspects of inclusion. There have been attempts to remove healthcare for the under-16s, and this is the famous Bell versus Tavistock case, which was rejected on appeal. And one of the goals of this case is to undermine or remove Gillick competence, which is important for the access of under-16s to contraception and abortion. Both Keira Bell and one of her lawyers have made it clear that attacking Gillick competence was a major aim of the lawsuit. And it is also the case that a number of the US laws against trans health care for under 18s has drawn explicitly on the Bell versus Tavistock case, although forgetting that it was actually dismissed on appeal. The statutory guidance on inclusion that was produced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission after the Equality Act 2010 was challenged unsuccessfully. This is when the EHRC was still standing up for equalities and human rights. And there have been a number of court cases about the census. The one that actually went to an actual judgment happened in Scotland, where it was rejected. There have been a number of attempts to attack inclusive services, including the grotesque sight of feminist organizations, also allegedly feminist organizations, suing rape crisis centers, at least 2 to my knowledge. And there have been sustained attacks on EDI in the workplace, with a number of employment tribunals, results of which are either ongoing or pending. And can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, as well as strictly access, as well as acts in the courts, we have political actions. So I've already mentioned the EHRC, SNISLY. EHRC was stacked by Boris Johnson's government with anti-rights and anti-trans commissioners. And this has resulted in doing a 180-degree reversal on their stance on conversion therapy, on gender recognition reform. They have issued non-statutory guidance which spends most of its time arguing with its own statutory guidance. And they've also done other things, including interfering in some of the court cases I've mentioned. Johnson government has also reversed its course or abandoned commitments on conversion therapy and gender recognition reform, as well as dog whistling merrily on a number of anti-trans themes. Their local election campaign, certainly in Scotland, was on a essentially illegal position on local authority bathrooms, or local authority financed bathrooms, so that would include schools. In the US, there have been a number of really quite horrific pieces of legislation passed, including criminalization of under 18 healthcare and indeed social transition, attacks on participation in sport, and again, another particularly grotesque provision in the name of safeguarding or protection, which is to essentially provide for the medical examination of any child that is thought to be suspect who wants to participate in sport, which has happened in at least 2 states. And then our old friend, bathroom law, one of the more entertaining ones recently or relatively recently in Tennessee. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, as I say, the anti-trans backlash has been less clear, or is often unclear about its policy goals. In recent evidence to the Scottish Parliament, they were somewhat more candid, including exclusion of trans people by default from single-sex spaces, the repeal of Gender Recognition Act, and mandatory conversion therapy for all under 16s. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. Getting into the nub of the paper for today, which is all about reasonable concerns. And the reasonable concerns rhetoric, as I've said, is all about protections and safeguarding of women and children. And there are a number of different themes to this, and not all of these will be covered in the paper or addressed in the paper. Now, one of them is that trans inclusion can be a cover for bad faith actors, which is not actually relevant for today particularly. Now, there is actually no evidence for pretty much any of this, so I'm not going to comment in detail on that. Now, trans women in themselves, and it tends to be trans women who are focused on, trans women are themselves a threat in single-sex spaces, so the story goes. The underlying logic here is that trans women are sexual predators or rapists. It has been said, and again, this was something that came up in the Scottish Parliament, cis women are viscerally repelled by trans women. So if trans women are in cis women's spaces, then this is going to cause emotional distress. Women need single-sex spaces and groups to organise, and the corollary of this is that inclusive groups need to be either shunned or actively campaign against, as is happening at the moment in Scotland, where we have a campaign going against, or a campaign going to set up buffer zones for abortion clinics. The leading group on this is very much an inclusive group and has been targeted by anti-trans feminists, supposed feminists. Exposure to gender ideology, so-called. Trans as children become corrupted by exposure to gender ideology. This is an argument for Section 28 style laws, and it will be familiar to anyone who was living through the 80s or 90s. Gay and lesbian children specifically are being converted. This is a major theme of the so-called LGB Alliance, who are only 7% L or G. We now have on record. So this is a sort of a further revision of the, or a specialization of the point about transing children. But essentially what's going on here is there is a replacement theory that the gay and lesbian community is being replaced by the trans community. Now, this is not borne out by any statistics. The recent ONS statistic showed that the lesbian and gay population has been growing significantly year on year since 2014. Trans community is also up. And again, in evidence, the Scottish Parliament, LGBT Alliance basically lied with a straight face about this data, which came out literally the same week. Lesbians specifically are being coerced by trans women. Again, this is the trans women as rapists line, but this also draws on the idea of trans people tricking unsuspecting partners. This used to be a big thing in the, well, really up until the 80s, I suppose. And a very famous case involving April Ashley is one of the sort of foundational moments of trans history. And lastly, again, this tends to focus on children. People are mutilating themselves before they can have experience of sex. Now, this gets into some fairly creepy territory, not least there's some very dodgy stuff about girls' breasts that comes in this kind of material. But the underlying idea here is that trans people are asexual, and this is obviously mutually exclusive with a lot of the other stuff here, which is that trans women, so in particular, are sexual predators. And also, we've also got other contradictions in this list. I mean, the idea that trans people are really gay men and women is, again, at odds with this idea that trans women are really cis, so trans women are really cis male sexual predators. So there's lots of different contradictions here. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk mostly about the issue of protection and spaces. So really the second one, but also the protection of children, which comes up a lot in this list. And these are all themes that are there in the Medea. What I'll also be saying, though, is that the underlying assumptions behind a lot of these reasonable concerns, and also underlying the more fundamental ideology, are exactly the same that are exposed in the Medea, and that's the nub of the paper. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to move on to talk about safe spaces. So when I'm talking about the Medea, I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, safe spaces, particularly single sex spaces of sorts. And then I'm going to talk about the killing of children and how Medea's actions fit into traditions, or not traditions, wrong word, trends in that area. And finally, I'm going to look at the interaction of otherness and materiality. And this is going to get into questions of essentialism, which are underlying the eliminationist ideology. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, as most people who work on Greek tragedy will be aware, and indeed most people who work on ancient Athens will be aware, there are huge issues around the gendering of space. And one of the things that has been much debated in the literature is just how far was there segregation in real life. What we can say is that in Greek tragedy, the presence of women in public coming out of domestic space is frequently commented on by those characters when they emerge, and this is what we have in Medea. Medea perhaps justifies it less than other people, but if you think, for example, of the prologue of the Antigone, for example, where it's a big theme. But Medea has to explain why she's arrived and come out, and that's true of not necessarily most women, but a lot of women in Greek tragedy. Now, I'm sliding around here between domestic space and gendered space, and it is an issue in ancient Greece, which is that although there tends to be an association of the domestic sphere with women, there is no sense in which the oikos is a solely female space. Moreover, it's also not the case that even within the oikos is there a separate set of women's quarters necessarily, or at least not in any hard way. So, for example, if you think about Lysias 1, where there is reference to women's quarters, one of the issues in the speech is about the women's quarters moving downstairs. So the household space is actually much more flexible than occasionally it's presented. And it's also the case that archaeological evidence for any separation of space in houses is actually really, really hard to see. And I suppose it's also worth bearing in mind that the area of the house that is the andron, the man's room, is simply the dining room. The extent to which a very straightforward connection or straightforward identification of domestic space and gender space is actually it's not there, and this also has parallels with the way that we think about space in our own culture, and in a lot of the work on protection, safeguarding, and so on. There is an implication in a lot of this that domestic space is somehow safe, and that domestic space is also gendered to a large extent, and it's not really true, obviously, in our own culture any more than it is in the ancient culture. More generally, in the ancient world, obviously, the gendered nature of space is highly class-based as well, or the ideology of segregation is also highly class-based. So, for example, we know that if you are a lower-class woman or a metic, then you are likely to be out and about quite a lot, and that's comedy depends. So a lot of Aristophanes depends upon that logic, for example. Now, the women in Greek tragedy, overwhelmingly coming from an upper class context, therefore more likely to be subject to segregation in an ideological sense, which is one of the reasons why it comes up so much. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, the question of how far this domestic space or this this gendered space is safe is one of the key themes of the Medea. Now, Medea comes out. She frequently, she's popping in and out of the house quite a lot in the play. That's also true of the children. The children come out at least twice in the play. Creon's daughter, who is one of Medea's targets, is never to be seen. She's always in the house. And if we think about the oikos as safe gendered space, Creon's daughter, who is being set up for marriage, is the canonical example. And that space is obviously shared with Medea. Now, Medea has form and Creon, king of Corinth, sorry, setup. I should do the setup, shouldn't I? I haven't done setup. So Medea, Jason and Medea are on the run from Iolcos, where they have managed to kill the king of Iolcos, Pelias. I'll come on to that in a moment. And they're in Corinth, and Jason is dumping, or in the process of dumping, has dumped Medea in order to marry the king's daughter. Medea is being sent into exile with her children by Creon at this point. Now, so Creon is worried that Medea is going to do something. Now, he frames this in various ways, one of which is about Medea's cleverness. And this is an allusion to her familiarity with herbs and magic to a certain extent. And you have to say that his precautions here are entirely sensible. Now, he doesn't always follow through on this, and he also manages, particularly when Medea gets kind of emotional at him, to start referring to her as foolish, which is so he never really quite is consistent about his suspicions of Medea. But he is concerned to protect his daughter, protect space. And oh, can I have the next slide, please? I keep moving to click the thing, and obviously I can't. But anyway. Now, Medea, her response to Creon is entertainingly mild. I should say, Creon, he also thinks that the language of cleverness is also because he sees her as a plotter and a planner, and that she doesn't have an angry, quick temper. This is again a misreading of her situation, but she does come across here as being quite placid, also recognizing that Creon is acting in accordance with social norms in seeking to perpetuate his oikos according to the logic of Greek patriarchy as we know it. Which he seems to accept from a logical, or not logical is the wrong word, but certainly as a reasoned position from Creon. Of course, this is not true. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, one of the reasons why all this is very ironic, her placidity, is because we know from the start that Medea has a violent past. So as well as helping Jason to steal the Golden Fleece, she convinces the daughters of Pelias to chop him up and boil him down in an effort to rejuvenate him, having previously demonstrated this technique with an animal, a goat, I think. I may be wrong about this. So this was in one of Euripides' earliest plays, Pelleiades, and would have been well known to the audience. But just in case it's not, this is emphasized here, and it crops up throughout the play, in fact. So we know that one of the inhabitants of this safe space is definitely not a safe person. There may also be other aspects of her betrayal of her family, but I'm not going to get into that here. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what we have in Medea is we have the setup of space. We have a cultural situation where the gendering of space is ideological rather than actual. What happens, of course, is that Medea kills Creon's daughter by the use of wedding gifts. So she claims to have had a change of heart and to have accepted Jason's marriage, and as a token of this, and as an effort to sustain a place for her children with Jason in this new family, she sends gifts of a robe and a diadem, both of which are poisoned. The poison will kill anyone who touches them, and it ends up killing both Creon's daughter and Creon himself, in fact. So that's the first stage of Medea's plan. And what we can see here is that the protections that are set up ideologically and actually of domestic space in the Medea are shown to be ineffective. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Now, Medea is characterized as someone who famously adopts a number of masculine modes of speech, particularly those around aristocratic heroic ideology. And so a lot of her interactions with Jason are, and some of the surrounding discussions are emphasizing that she is approaching the question of her treatment very much through the idea of heroic ideology, which is very much a zero-sum game when it comes to honor. Also, it's a game that is focused on materiality. So you measure your honor by stuff. One of the motivations that she has in killing Jason's wife to be and Creon is a revenge model which comes out of this honor logic. But there are other aspects too of her motives and in particular why she kills the children, doesn't kill Jason, and why she kills the bride but not Jason is not perhaps immediately in tune with the heroic ideology. I mean, you would normally kind of kill your rival and taunt them as they're dying. That's much more of a good heroic way of doing things. So there are a number of different sort of competing elements here, and one of them is that her attack on Jason is essentially an ideological one, because it's attacking his oikos, and that removing both his oikos to be in Corinth and his existing one, while it is possible, of course, that Jason could go and get a new wife, he would no doubt be persona non grata in Corinth at this point. So this is what's going on. But we then also have to think about how Medea it relates to her children, and what we actually get is quite a lot of oscillation in Medea over whether or not she's going to kill the children or not. And some of that is about a tension between, I suppose, let's say, traditional notions of motherhood on the one hand, and these logical factors, both the heroic ideology and the, I suppose you could say, the degenerative one of destroying the oikos, which is making a point. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, Medea's actions in killing her children. These are obviously one of the key shocking elements of the play. And it is the case that whenever there is killing of children or other forms of abuse committed by women, there is a shock and surprise in the media. And it really shouldn't be shocking or surprising. The data on this makes this quite clear. And the fact that we do find it shocking and surprising is rooted in the same ideological assumptions that are the foundations of the Medea. So, although it's absolutely true that women are far less likely to commit murder than men in general, where they do commit murder is particularly in relation to children. So, for example, infanticide, and by that I mean under 1 year, is something committed almost exclusively, well, not exclusive, that's too strong, overwhelmingly by women in the data. And that may actually be underestimated given the way that abandonment is recorded in particularly low to middle income countries. There's a study in South Africa which makes that point quite explicitly. Although the studies on the gender of perpetrators of filicide, that's say murder of children or birth children, is relatively sparse. The situation with regard to infanticide is fairly clear. At other age levels, it's not quite as clear, but a 50-year study in Canada showed that essentially what happens is that the proportion of women committing murder in older age groups declines until we get to sort of 16. And after 16, it's not so much a factor. And most of the murder is then men on men. Now, for the cohort up to age 16 as a whole, the proportions of in terms of gender are roughly 50-50. So we really shouldn't be surprised that women commit murder of children. Also, it should be said that for all deaths of children, the overwhelming background of the perpetrator is a parent or a step parent, and to a slightly lesser and there is a smaller group of people who are known to the child, and strangers are a tiny proportion. So domestic space, domestic spheres, and domestic actors are the principal context for killing of children, which is what Medea is drawing out. Now, qualitative data is even less easy to get hold of, but a qualitative study in the US on filicide suicide, so murder-suicide involving children, brought some interesting comparisons between genders. So one of the things that is typical of men committing filicide suicide is that they take out not only their entire family, but also anyone else who's around, other children, other adults. And it usually is an act of revenge against their partner. Now, when women commit filicide, it tends to be in the context of marital crisis, but it's not perpetrated as an act of revenge, according to the data, or according to the study at least. And in a sense, it's more self-directed against themselves and their children. Now, if you think about Medea from this point of view, in some respects, she acts much more like a man, because there is definitely a revenge plot going on. But she's not acting like a man in the sense that she's not taking out Jason as well. I mean, if it was following the kind of the male pattern, taking out the entire family. So there's a real mix of if this is any cross-cultural validity at all, there's a bit of a mix in Medea between acting like a man, acting like a woman, which is not hugely surprising, in fact. Can I have the next slide? So I'm thinking about Medea's, I mean, a lot of the last part of the play is about her oscillating somewhat between whether she's going to kill the children or not, whether she's going to take them in exile with her or whether she's going to kill them. And this tends to be framed much more in terms of an opposition between will her enemies laugh at her, and this is about honor and status again, if she allows essentially her enemies to treat her like this, on the one hand, and a more, I suppose, maternal relationship on the other. But I think there are other factors that we might want to think about in relation to Medea kind of coming out of this sort of data in terms of considering filicide from because of the crisis nature of the situation. We have the discussion about step families in this play, also taking them into exile again. So there are a number of factors here that might be worth thinking about beyond simply the maternity versus heroic ideology kind of thing. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so where we're at so far is that we've got safe spaces that aren't space, safe spaces that aren't safe, and safe gender spaces that aren't safe for that particular gender. And we have the murder of children by domestic actors, perpetrators who are known to them, and specifically their mother. So the next element in this, and I've already been alluding to this to some extent, is the question of, I suppose, what it is to be a mother. And where Medea fits into that kind of question. And what we see with Medea is that on the one hand, she is quite significantly othered. Now, we've seen that already with her adoption of masculine language. We've seen it with her cleverness around drugs and so forth, which makes her different, certainly. And it is deepened as the play goes on. On the other hand, she is also emphatically represented as physically a mother, and in ways that is much more the case than is usually done in Greek drama. So can I have the next slide, please? So with the present of the gifts to the daughter of Creon, that again emphasizes her, I suppose we often talk about Medea as a witch, but anyway, as a cunning woman, I suppose we might say. And then, of course, there is the famous escape in the Chariot of the Sun. So Medea is othered in other ways. She's othered in the sense that she has divine connections. And, oh, I haven't mentioned, of course, that she's obviously from Colchis. She's not Greek. So there's, in a sense, an attempt to try and, or there could be thought to be an attempt to try and excuse Medea's extreme actions by identifying her as beyond the pale in all sorts of ways. She's not a natural woman. She's not a normal woman. She is somehow different. And that would be dandy were it not for things that she says. So can I have the next slide, please? So these are the famous lines of Medea, most famous lines about Medea, would she prefer to stand in the battle line 3 lines than to give birth once? Now it's worth spending some time unpicking this. One of the things that this is doing is emphasizing the dangers and pain of childbirth, something that is very often elided in idealizations of gendered oppositions and specifically in a lot of essentialist discourse. And if we think about the dangers of pregnancy in a pre-medical context versus the risks of standing in a glorified rugby scrum, which is the hoplite phalanx, you can see that she's got more than a point. And what this is also suggesting is that the notion of safe, protected space, which obviously, and I think I didn't really say this earlier, but a lot of the reasons why you have all these safe protected spaces so that you can preserve your oikos, because in a context where you don't have any way of knowing the paternity of a child, it is in the interest of men to control the autonomy of their wives. But this can be framed in terms of protection here, and akindinos, protected without risk and so forth, safeguarded, if you like, which is rejected by Medea. Where is the main threat to the health and safety of women? It's not through bad actors, it's through giving birth. So all of this, if you like, this blowing apart of patriarchal assumptions around gender, or indeed essential notions around the nature of women, are made even as it emphasizes that Medea is bodily female. So bodies matter in Medea, as they say, but she is making the point that the evaluation of them is a construct and it's in the interests of men, and it is to be rejected. She stands away from this. She refuses childbirth here. And you can see the death of the children here as a symbolic act from that point of view, rejecting childbirth in general. So can I have the next slide, please? Now, this isn't the only case where, only instance where this dialogue of othering and emphasizing the materiality of childbirth and postnatal care comes up in Greek tragedy. And Greek tragedy is interestingly more explicit about this than, say, for example, Greek comedy. You might expect old comedy to be much more kind of upfront about bodily processes in this way, but it's not. It's much more a thing in certain Greek tragedies. So the other great masculinized woman, Clytemnestra, is also one who is very much focused on her body, but also someone who rejects the role to a certain extent. And it gets complicated because of what happens in Eumenides. But in the Agamemnon and the libation bearers, I think you can see elements of the rejection, but also you get the mess and sleepless nights of having young children. Just before this scene, you have the nurse Chylissa rolling up and talking about how Orestes was as a baby. And you know, it's the only bit as far as I know in Greek drama which talks about dirty nappies. So the materiality of childbirth is, and childcare is very much to the fore as you get the as you get Clytemnestra's interaction with her son. Of course, the first thing she says about her son is, "Fetch me a man-slaying axe as quickly as possible." I think my favorite line in Greek tragedy. It is a rejection of this physical, biological relationship, if you like. Also, it should be said that the nurse in the libation bearers rather suggests that Clytemnestra has subcontracted most of the relevant work, which perhaps undermines some of the more kind of biological elements. On which note, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So after she's called for the axe and Orestes has his crisis of conscience about killing his mother, which Pylades tells him to get over, Clytemnestra makes lots of appeals to him in terms of the mother-child relationship, but she starts again by emphasizing the physicality, with indicating a breast and talking about breastfeeding and so on. How much breastfeeding she actually did is again open to question, given what we know about the nurse. So with Clytemnestra, as with Medea, we have a situation where what should be, I suppose, if you're thinking about an essentialist understanding of womanhood, focused on reproduction, is undermined by the stepping outside of those expected roles. And it's not, importantly, it's not denying physicality, it's just pointing out that social roles are not dictated by, or need not be dictated by, biology. And the reason I stress this point is that in the anti-trans rhetoric, the answer to the question of what is a woman is usually indicated by the reproductive system, womb and ovaries, and to a lesser extent by chromosomes. Now, there are obviously issues with just how binary either the reproductive systems or chromosomes can be. There are grey areas which are usually skated over. But the crucial point here is that if you define yourself, or if you define women in terms of reproductive system, then that definition soon slides into function, which is obviously being denied by Medea and also by Clytemnestra. Now, you could say, you might say, that slide is not inevitable, perhaps, but it's surprising how often it happens, and particularly in patriarchal discourse. But not only in patriarchal discourse. So one of the more amusing things that happened this week was one of the more influential anti-trans activists in the UK getting extremely upset at one of the other main anti-trans organizations in the UK at their conference, having speakers referring to women as baby-making machines, which was being described as, quote, a gender stereotype, which, given that this person runs or is heavily involved in a website known as Sex Matters, showed a certain lack of self-awareness, I think it's fair to say. So the issues in Medea and in Agamemnon and Libation Bearers, which are well known, about how far women's roles are essential or constructed, are absolutely relevant to the anti-trans discourse. And that's not surprising because most mainstream feminists are entirely supportive of trans people, as is emphasized in poll after poll. One of the ideological moves that you see with anti-trans rhetoric is to try to present it as it's a conflict between women and trans women, whereas, sorry, between cis women and trans women, I should say, and this is entirely not borne out by the evidence. Anyway, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we're moving towards a conclusion here. And so if you think about, we've had in Medea, we see the question of who commits murders, who is violent, where are safe spaces, what is the nature of a woman. These are all factors that are underlying the both the reasonable concerns of which are promulgated by the anti-trans movement, but also the underlying eliminationist ideology. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is the last one. Thank you. So, given that this is meant to be kind of a reception paper, as I understand it, I will make the claim that the rhetoric of reasonable concerns is replaying the structural misogyny that is handed down to us from antiquity. Now, I haven't really got time to make that argument in any detail, so I'm not going to. If you don't like that proposition, then this whole thing could be seen as a comparative exercise, and we'll just leave it at that. The Medea shows that notions of gendered space are themselves problematic. And actually, one thing I didn't say about gendered space is that a number of the contexts which are singled out as gendered space in the anti-trans rhetoric, such as toilets and prisons, are not single-sex spaces. So, for example, you get male cleaners. In fact, in Glasgow Central Railway Station, you have just male cleaners of the women's toilets. In prisons, you have male guards, for example. Anyway, but the underlying ideology is shown up to be just that in the Medea, and this is entirely relevant to today. And in particular, safe spaces, if you exclude trans women from safe spaces, or if you exclude trans women from single-sex spaces, this doesn't mean that they become automatically safe. Now, as I've said, the evidence for trans women committing heinous acts in toilets is non-existent in the UK. And in terms of prisons, in one of the cases that I mentioned, no, I didn't actually put on something. There was a case brought by I think it's actually a prisoner in one of the women's estates prisons under pressure from or under the auspices of various organizations. The anti-trans organizations data involves well, basically it's rubbish. It takes isolated cases from across the globe because there are so few examples, and the quality of their data was singled out as being appalling by the judge in that case. Anyway, that's a slight side issue. Well, not side issue, that's a background issue. Exclude trans women from safe spaces, then they do not become safe. Again, another thing I didn't say earlier, the evidence for assaults in women's prisons is horribly high. Now, it's not as horribly high as it is in the men's estate, but women's prisons are by no definition safe spaces. And so one of the things you get from the Medea is that the idea of women as perpetrator, which is still seen as shocking and denied. Women cannot commit these kinds of actions, usually because there is some essential quality. This is belied by the Medea, and it's also belied by the data. If we think about children, because a lot of the rhetoric is about the safeguarding of children, think about where and when and by whom children are at risk. And it is overwhelmingly in the domestic safe space by people who are known to them, and especially their parents or step-parents. Actually, usually stepfather, not so much stepmother. Now, this is not surprising. This is not unusual. This is any work that's done on safeguarding children will tell you that that is where the risks are. It is something that somehow seems to be lacking from the media. And again, when children are being weaponized in the anti-trans discourse, it seems to go out the window. You are not going to be at risk from a strange trans person. And again, Medea makes this point plain. More widely, the Medea and other Greek tragedies make the point that essentialism is problematic, and it makes that argument by not by shying away from biology and from the materiality of bodies, but precisely by emphasizing the community between Medea and other women. Medea is unusual, but she's not unwoman. And so, and this is true of essentialist feminism, just as it's true of patriarchy exploiting essentialism. And indeed, one might say that essentialism is essentially a patriarchal doctrine. So in sum, Medea exposes the foundations of anti-trans discourse, and the kinds of ideological assumptions that it exposes in a Greek context are just those that we are suffering from today. Thank you.